Hi, you're listening to Face the Sun. My name is Gaia, and I'm your host. Welcome to a show where I discuss matters of religion, belief, and unbelief. For this week's episode, I have 4 guests on, which is a challenge because I've never had more than one guest. So it was exciting for me to not only see what it was like to have more people on and really have an open discussion. I got several people on board is because we discussed a debate. The debate was between Sam Harris and William Lane Craig. They had the debate in 2011, and it was at Notre Dame University. The title of the debate was called, Are the Foundations of Moral Values Natural or Supernatural? While in the conversation, we don't solve morality. We don't solve, is it objective because of God or is it objective because of science? We are openly talking about the conflicts that we see from our perspective. I'll start this episode introducing my guests. All 4 of my guests are Christians. 2 of them are pastors of churches nearby, and 2 of them are congregants of those 2 churches. I work to have at least one other atheist, and I did have a great response from a university. The philosophy department said they would be interested in my next debate conversation, but they were already booked, so they couldn't make it to this one. So it was me with 4 other Christians, and I have to say that they were all very thoughtful and kind, and it was really great to get to know them better and talk about our perceptions of morality. So I hope you enjoy the episode. Before we start on the discussion about objective morality, I just want to begin with an introduction for my guests. We have Eric Stillman, who's the pastor of NewLife Christian Fellowship in Wethersfield. Hi, Eric.
Hi, Gaia. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
I'm glad you're here. So, Eric, you were the first interview I ever did on my podcast a year ago when I was really learning the ropes, and I'm glad that you were willing to go there with me. And I had an episode on your church. It was nice to go to at NewLife Christian Fellowship. That was a really nice time to be a part of that.
It was great to have you. I'm proud of you. You've come a long way. Keep growing in this podcast.
I am learning through sweating it out, as you were very helpful to me as I've been preparing for this day. And next I want to interview Scott Solberg. He is the pastor of Wethersfield Evangelical Free Church in Wethersfield, Connecticut. Thanks for being here, Scott.
Glad to be here, Gaia. Thank you.
I did an episode on your church as well in the early days, and I've also referenced your church a few times on my podcast, especially in your topics on racism, and I've appreciated that very much. And I just wanted to say thank you for that opportunity to get to know you better and hear you give some talks that were very difficult, but I've been able to actually refer to them in the process of my podcast as well. So thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you.
I next want to say we have Adam Lewis. Hi, Adam.
Hey.
Adam emailed me after an episode that I did at Wethersfield Evangelical Free Church, and then a friendship blossomed from there. And I've had Adam on the podcast a few times. And I've also had the pleasure of being able to get to know your wife, Alyssa, and the 3 kids who are wonderful, to hang out in your backyard and get to know you better. So yeah. I'm glad you're on. And then for our 4th guest, we have Rich Porter. Rich emailed me about his interest in the topics that Eric and I had discussed, and he covered his background in apologetics. So we've had some email and text and phone conversations, and we thought that it might be nice to have him on, given his interest in apologetics. Although this will be very much a discussion, not a debate. We're just going to unfold and relax and talk. I'm happy to have all of you here. I also just want to...
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. I also want to thank, again, Eric, because Eric was willing to host at NewLife today, and we had a change to do it on Zoom, which I get now an opportunity to learn how to do Zoom recording. But I want to thank you, Eric, because you were willing to get ready with all the mics and moving the furniture and getting ready for all of us to be there and be safe during COVID. So we'll look forward to maybe another time for that. But I thank you so much.
Welcome.
So what I think I'm going to do is start off with defining objective morality. And then maybe what we could do is, I don't know where my papers are, so I might mute myself and go find them when we start to talk about it. But I'll just read out what I have for objective morality. And then maybe what we can do is if somebody wants to start off talking about that first section of our paperwork or of the debate is when William Lane Craig gives his 20-minute discussion. If people want to break that down and give their thoughts on that, then we can turn to Sam Harris on his 20 minutes and maybe pull out some thoughts and go from there, if that's okay. For the definition I have for objective morality, it says the belief that morality is universal, not up for interpretation, that objective is not influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering facts or representing facts. And then subjective would be is what we're understanding or feeling. It's our opinion or personal experiences. Does anybody want to, while I go find my paperwork, does anybody want to have a few conversations or a few thoughts on that first 20-minute section when William Lane Craig was talking? Did anybody grab some thoughts they want to share?
I could say a few things. First off, I thought it was interesting that Craig essentially presented an argument that either person agreed with. It wasn't an argument for God's existence. It was based on the conditional that if God exists, we have a foundation for objective morality or moral realism. And so I thought that was interesting because it's a little less controversial, and Craig usually in his other debates will just flat out present a moral argument for God's existence. So it was a little bit of a switch on his part. And it made sense because the topic of the debate essentially was surrounding Sam Harris's book that came out at the time. So I thought that was interesting. And Craig just laid out the case, starting off with what theologians and philosophers would call perfect being theology. So he defined God as a maximally great being, and omnibenevolence being one of the what we'd call great making properties God would have. And just essentially spelled out his case that in light of Harris's position, the atheistic naturalistic position, it's hard to see human beings having intrinsic worth and value and therefore having any sort of moral duties and obligations which flow from moral values. And I just thought it was interesting that Craig switched up his, and mind you, this is near 10 years ago, but Craig switched up his normal presentation style from a moral argument to something a little less controversial and an argument that both people could agree to, even though Sam Harris does affirm objective morality, and he does so in his book. This is something that jumped out at me at first as someone who's followed Bill Craig for a long time.
Yeah, so Richard, what you said is he wasn't trying to prove whether there was a God or not. In fact, he said his argument wouldn't change if he believed or if he was convinced that there wasn't a God. So he was saying that the existence of moral, objective reality is dependent upon the existence of a God. I think you're right in saying that he took that tact instead of trying to. In fact, I found him continually being frustrated because he kept trying to bring Sam Harris back to that as the main premise that he was trying to process.
Yeah, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but there was a lot of trying to bring it back to the actual topic, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point. That was a really standout point in this debate.
And Gaia, you had mentioned about the definition for objective moral, and I thought it was a pretty good definition at the beginning, where he talked about it being valid and binding and independent of human opinion. That's what Craig brought out at the beginning as to this is what we're talking about, objective moral values. So I thought that was a helpful addition to just thinking through what they're talking about when they're talking about objective moral.
From what I understand for the topic of the debate is are the foundations for moral values natural or supernatural? I would fall with Sam Harris in saying that it's independent of human opinion. I think that they both did a fine job of stating what they thought. I know that Craig changed it up a little bit, but I think that Sam Harris was able to be solid in saying that there can be a moral objective and him turning to science for the reason, so that human opinion being subjective, that wasn't the nature of it.
Could I ask what you meant by saying Craig changed it up? I don't understand.
I think that he believes that there's a God and that he is coming from the perspective of backing up that there's morality because of a God. I felt like him saying that there cannot be morality if there isn't a God. I think that wasn't the point for him to state that there is morality because there's a God, and for him to defend why there's morality because there's a God.
So, right, the topic of the debate was, are the foundations of morality natural or supernatural? And Craig was just saying that without God's existence, you can't have objective morality, moral realism. So that was the debate topic. I'm not understanding where Craig switched it up. I think Sam Harris was the one who was getting off topic. So I'm curious.
Then that would jump in front of what you were saying of Sam Harris going off, because I don't see how he did. He was able to state how there's morality without a God.
I think
So
okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, Gaia, as I was listening, because my outline of how the debate went, it seemed like Craig made his contention for how objective morality was dependent upon whether or not there's a supernatural being. Then Harris made his contention that he doesn't think that objective morality depends upon a supernatural being. Then I thought Craig refuted Harris and was saying he kind of gave the reasons why he felt like Sam Harris's argument didn't work. And then I thought Sam Harris's second section was changing the subject and saying, what your gods mean.
Oh, okay.
that's how I felt like how the outline went. And so all of a sudden it was like, wait a minute. And that's where in the next section, Craig was like, that's a red herring. That kind of has taken it off track of what the whole point is. We're not talking about a specific God or specific parts of the Bible. We're just trying to answer the question about objective morality and whether you can have objective morality without a God or a supernatural being, whether there's such a thing as objective morality. Yeah, as I guess I am in agreement with Rich, is that when I was reading, it seemed like we were on track until that fourth section, and then all of a sudden it became your gods mean. And that's where it's switched.
Yeah, and if you listen to the course of the debate, in Craig's opening statement, he presented the perennial problem for Harris's position, which is the is-ought problem. How do you derive an ought from an is? So science describes things, right? It doesn't make value judgments. Now, that doesn't mean that science can't help us make value judgments. You can analyze data points and so on and so forth. Harris never responded to that. And that was the principal objection to his position. And so
I think he did address the value points. And one of the things that he stated was that for well-being, and when it comes down to defining that and defining the value points, is how do you define health? Health is not puking, vomiting constantly. And health is not having a high fever all day, all night. So that you have a value there of health. But then what is really health? Health is I can only run so fast. And Scott's who's a runner who could run faster than I can. So does that mean he's healthier than I am? Is that how we're measuring it? I think there's value in defining things. And I think that when Sam Harris explained, we take the worst pain and suffering of every single person, if we can explain and define, we agree that's the worst, feeling better than that, if we can agree that there's change when we feel not the worst suffering. So that there's value in science, and science also being somewhat squishy in that you have the psychology of science and you have sociology of science. And although we can use psychology, Eric, was his master's degree in counseling, knows that you can have psychology sit with a client and be able to determine that they're schizophrenic or that they're bipolar, but they're depressed. So we're still using the science of psychology to figure out how we're going to address things. So I think that science is for me, it's the ultimate on figuring things out. I just want to.
Could I just respond to, because that's a lot to respond to, and then obviously I don't want to dominate the conversation here. But so the point about health, the issue there is, if something is objective, it doesn't come in degrees. Health and strength and the ability to run can come in degrees. I remember he brings up the fact, based upon your ability to run, does that determine how healthy you are? That comes in degrees. That's relative to your bone structure, your genetics, how you're built. I'll never be as fast as Usain Bolt. It doesn't matter how many Olympic coaches I have, that sort of thing. And as far as the is-ought problem, that doesn't respond to it, though, because it doesn't say why we ever should. It doesn't explain why we should behave a particular way. at best, science can tell us that things are a certain way. It's descriptive, but it's not prescriptive. Science doesn't dictate moral norms. Moral philosophy is an a priori discipline, that is prior to experience. So that's the opposite of empirical knowledge gained via the senses, which is what science is based around. So I don't see, personally, I just didn't see how Harris answered the is-ought problem. But I don't know if someone else has any thoughts.
Adam, what about you?
So my general thought on the debate was this. Neither of them can actually make a full claim that this is the way that you can find morality. I appreciate where Craig comes from. I'm a Christian myself. But to say that without a God, you cannot have objective morality is basically saying we know everything there is to know, and there is zero other possibility of finding objective morality without the God. And you can't make that. So Craig is essentially making a belief statement. I believe objective morality comes from the divine, comes from God. And then on the other side, you have Harris, who's making equally a belief statement. He's saying, I think you can find objective morality from science. And I agree with Rich that it's a weaker argument, right? Because science can tell you what is, but there's no way of looking at science and saying, because we know what is, we know what should be. That takes a subjective opinion. You have to input your own idea of what you think should be and then use science to reach that point. But at the core of the debate, both of them are making a belief claim because neither of them we don't know everything. So you can't say without God, you have no other means of finding objective morality. It's not something that you can say because we don't know. We haven't reached the end of all that there is to know.
That's an epistemology issue. How do you know what you know? Right. But we would say we know by revelation. So revelation tells us there's a God. And so that forms the basis of our morality, which gets into a whole different issue that we're processing. I think Harris raised a good tension that he wrestles with, I think, in his tribe, if you will, because he's looking at this thing and he's saying he's concerned where he says, now the sense is that without the conviction that moral truth exists, the words like right, wrong, good, evil actually mean something. He said humanity will lose its way. And so he's expressing a concern that if there is no sense of right or wrong, and he's actually, I think he's arguing, I read earlier, I'm trying to find it in another book I have, where Dawkins is basically saying, we can't say there's an absolute right or wrong. He's arguing against some of his fellow atheists with regards to this. And so I think he raises a tension where he says that his concern for humanity is that if there is no sense of morality, then that spells trouble for humanity. And he raises the issue that he's wrestling with because he's saying that there has to be some sense of a right and a wrong. I agree with, Rich in how I don't think he adequately defends how you have an objective morality without a God. But he's raising the sense of a need for an objective morality. I agree with Craig how he redefines it in a way where he talks about it being human flourishing, which I don't think is equivalent to a moral and the moral good and evil. I think that's a weakness in his argument.
You think it's a weakness, just for clarification, Scott, you think it's a weakness for him to say well-being or flourishing, human flourishing?
Human flourishing is subjective. It's subjective. Like who determines what human flourishing is? In fact, I think even in our common cultural arguments that we deal with, I think one of the reasons why we have such cultural challenges in dealing with moral issues, and the reason why it seems like we're two groups that are talking over each other is because we're coming at very different presuppositions of how we determine morality. And someone who may say, I get my morality based on revelation where God gives command. That was part of his argument. And a Christian would say that these commandments are for human flourishing. There's a reason why these commandments are given. Someone outside of that worldview may say, I find that to be repressive. I don't find that to be conducive to human flourishing. So if the issue is human flourishing, we have subjective different opinions as to what human flourishing is. And so to define morality around that, I think Craig is right. You're redefining what good and evil is. But what I appreciate about Harris is that he's wrestling with the tension because he sees the detriment that there is to humanity without this sense of morality. And I think he's pushing back on some of, and he gave that great illustration of that woman he had that conversation with. He's pushing back on.
Is that the one with the burqa, the eyes, pulling your eyes out of your head?
In his first,
every third child?
Yeah. But I think she was carrying some of her convictions to its furthest degree.
Yeah. What were you thinking, Eric? I saw you.
Yeah, Scott, I appreciate what you were saying there about, you think of our current cultural conversations and how if we have different understandings of what flourishing is, then it's going to be we're going to have a hard time arriving. So I was trying to think of this specifically. I'm thinking, all right, so think about the transgender issue. I'm thinking, all right, so you've got individuals who are experiencing gender dysphoria and feeling like they are trapped in the wrong gendered body. And you're going to have individuals who undergo irreversible surgery to identify as a different gender. So we're pretty early in the transgender experiment. So what about if in 20 years we look back and we have data and we've started doing studies on this and we find that for 40% of the individuals who underwent surgery, they feel like their lives are better for it. And 60% say, you know what, it didn't really address the underlying issues. And even though I changed gender, it didn't deal with the root issues that I was experiencing. And I wish I hadn't gone through with the surgery. So what do you do as a scientist or as a culture? Are you saying, well, if it was flourishing for 40%, then we should outlaw it? Or if it's flourishing for 60%, we should allow it? Or is it like, at what level do you say this is good for individuals and we should allow 10-year-olds or 12-year-olds to say, I don't identify as a boy anymore, I identify as a girl? How are you deciding what's flourishing? And then take it away from the individual and bring it to society. So what about in the case of you've got one individual who was assigned male at birth, identifies as a female, and now runs track in high school and wins every race. Now he's experienced, or she now is experiencing flourishing and feeling like, wow, this is amazing. I really appreciate who I am. And then there's 99 other girls who are not experiencing flourishing because there's someone who was born a male who is dominating every race. And now these girls are experiencing misery, as Harris would say, because of it. So do you outlaw it because it's good for one person, but bad for 99? This is where I understand him saying human flourishing and trying to define it as that, but it becomes very difficult to define, I think, what is human flourishing, and are we prioritizing one individual over the 99? Is there a percentage at which a certain number of individuals need to experience it as flourishing to make it okay? Is science going to get to a point where we say we're outlawing this transgender thing because we're finding that a lot of people who change it's winding up being detrimental for 13-year-olds to change their gender? Again, I'm not making a value judgment on it. I'm just saying I'm having a hard time understanding how you would define human flourishing.
So do you guys remember the part where Craig delivered what he called the knockdown argument against Harris's position? It's all taken from Harris's book. Harris admitted to the possibility that well-being and the good are not synonymous. And Craig drew that out. And mind you, Craig was one of numerous philosophers who reviewed Harris's book and all came to the same conclusion. And he came essentially to make Craig's argument right there a little bit more concise. What he's saying is that, so philosophers use what's called possible world semantics. That's just a fancy way of saying a possible world is just a fancy way to test an idea, whether or not it's coherent. So I could say there's a possible world that elephants are green. That's just testing whether or not the idea is logically coherent. Craig pointed out that self-admittedly in Harris's book, and he probably said in pieces in the debate, that if the good and human well-being are at least possibly not the same, then it follows that they're not the same. So Craig gives I believe it was the illustration where if you have a possible world where rapists dominate and rape is the means of achieving well-being and rape is objectively wrong, then it follows that human well-being is not synonymous with the good, because rape is objectively wrong. So that's, Craig laid it out in more premises. There's more steps to that, but that's just a concise way of explaining the knockdown argument, as Craig calls it. And I think he's exactly right.
When I was listening to you talk about transgendered and also referring to rape, one of the things that I think I'll take the transgendered one first, or subsidiary of that, and to ask that if you would cease to love your child if you learned that they were gay. And I'm going to guess, I think I know the answer of that from you, Eric, and you, Scott, and you, Adam. I don't know if do you have any children, Rich?
I do.
Would you wouldn't cease to love them if they were gay? I would assume not. Yeah. So in asking that question of Christians, I think that the Bible would say certain things that would be putting people to death, or that people will lean to their Bible and their God for their objective morality and what they think is morally correct, and throw their kid out of their house and do away with them. So I think that when we look at, is the atheist trying to determine what's right and wrong here and doing the best that they can based on human flourishing and well-being, and the Christian is going to the Bible on things of homosexuality and making some very, what I would think would be wrong decisions of throwing your child out of their house. That, and then when I also think about the comment about rape, there are things in the Bible that talk about rape. And in Deuteronomy chapter 22, I think that the two pastors here probably are more familiar with that verse. And Adam, I think I texted that to you at one stage, where an unengaged woman, if she's raped, then the rapist has to pay 50 shekels for her and buy her. And I've heard theologians describe that and say it was a different time back then. A woman had to be a virgin, or if she wasn't, and then all of a sudden she was outcast. And my feeling on that is that if God is going to be declaring things and saying, this is what you need to do, the declaring should be stone that scumbag who raped the woman, rather than make her pay 50 shekels. So I think that sometimes that where it gets, I think it can be a hard line of what's right and what's wrong. So.
Rape was punishable by death by Levitical law, just so we're clear.
Just so we're clear, that Deuteronomy 22 does not state that the man was to be put to death, but the man was to marry the woman that he raped if she was not engaged to be married.
So to unpack that passage, this is getting off topic. I think this is what happened in the debate. To unpack that passage and what I just said, I think we go way too far afield, but there's more to it than that. But so to bring it back to Harris and Craig in the debate discussion on atheism, so I guess I could just ask you, Raya, so this is the problem, I think, ultimately. What obligates me to act in a certain kind of way to other people? Not what are the results of my actions, right? Because Harris is espousing what's called well-being utilitarianism, which is a form of consequentialism. Basically just means that consequences of our moral actions should dictate whether or not we perform them or we don't.
That's some of it, but yeah.
And so, well, there's different types. There's act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism, but right, I'm just giving the gist of what consequentialism is. But I guess my question is, given atheistic naturalism, where's the source of obligation? Why should I not do as I please?
Yeah, I agree. The question is always comes down to, I'll let Guy answer. But yeah, what do you say to someone else to convince them that what they're doing is wrong? How do you convince someone that slavery, or racism, or throwing their gay son out of their house, or any of that is wrong, objectively wrong? Because it's one thing to say, I believe this, but it's another thing to say that you ought to believe this as well. And where does the obligation come from in Harris's worldview?
I think, where does it come from in the Christian point of view? Because why should I not do as I please? I think that we already are seeing Christians do what they please in regards to racism and in regards to how they're treating their gay children.
But Christians not upholding a moral standard doesn't do anything to affirm your position. So people are morally defective. That's sort of, Genesis 1-3, 101, right? People are morally defective. I don't want this to turn into Christian. This isn't really about Christianity. We don't even really have to talk about Christianity. I want to know on atheistic naturalism where the source of obligation comes from. Because at least for the Christian theist, or just any theist, really, we can say God is the locus, the paradigm of moral goodness. Whereas the atheist, I don't think, has those resources.
Yeah, the atheist doesn't have the books that different religions will turn to that will be problematic in and of themselves. And the atheist doesn't have that to turn to, but that...
They don't come from books, though. They come from God.
Okay. I don't believe in a God, so I understand that you believe that it comes from something else, but I don't see any difference between you and me, or I don't see any difference. I do see that people who believe something turn to, how do you know what's right and wrong? Is God whispering this in your ear? Are you reading it in the Bible, or how are you getting this? I think Scott had referred to something being...
Yeah, no, those are all great questions. I fully agree with Scott that part of it's revelation, but Scripture itself attests to the fact that we all have moral intuitions that more or less understand, that we understand human beings fairly universally by way of moral experience, whether certain things are right and certain things are wrong. But getting back to my question, how are you grounding moral obligation given atheistic naturalism?
So one of the topics that Scott Harris had approached was evolution, that we have evolutionary changed over the years, that what we're assessing is what's right or wrong and changing over time. And I think it's what we're doing that affects other people, that affects others. And so when you talk about sexually assaulting someone, when Penn Jillette was stating that he rapes as much as he wants to rape, which is 0. And then somebody who believes in a God, this higher God, rapes. So how are we able to say that I think I'm going to let somebody else answer.
Yeah,
that's...
I really would I agree that I think it's a really good discussion to look at this debate, between Harris and Craig, and ask the question of moral obligation of, so as a theist, you can just point to right or wrong. You don't have to agree with what the books say or what the supposed God says, but they can point and say, everyone should do this because God, who created everything, has said this is good. And you could say, and in the end, there will be a judgment day, and you will be accountable for the decisions and actions you have made on that day. So there's a couple things I guess you could point to as a theist, whether is Muslim or a Christian or whatever, and say there's reasons that I can say everyone should behave this way. This is right and this is wrong. But I think someone like a Sam Harris is very motivated to be a quote unquote good person. Like, he's trying really hard for flourishing, human flourishing. But there's plenty of people out there who could care less about human flourishing. And so on what basis does he tell Hitler and Nazi Germany, what you're doing is wrong and you need to stop? If for them, Hitler was voted into power and there's social consensus in Germany that this is what is right, to put the Jews in the gas chamber, and they believe they have evolution on their side because they believe that there's inferior life forms that need to be exterminated. And so they have evolution on their side, they have social consensus on their side, they have the will of the people on their side, they think they're doing what is right. As a Christian, I'm saying that's wrong, because murder is wrong, because yes, God has declared murder to be wrong, and every human being is made in the image of God, whether or not they're German, Jewish, whatever. But I don't know where Sam Harris gets it from. So when you look at Nazi Germany and you've got Hitler, and they would say social consensus is on their side. Everyone thinks it's right to kill off the Jews. They've got evolution on their side, they think, because they think that evolution is about survival of the fittest, and the strong survive, the weak die, and the Jews and all these people are inferior life forms, and society would be better if we get rid of them. On what basis does a Sam Harris say to them, you are wrong, you're objectively wrong? Again, as a Christian, I can say God said do not murder. He says every human being is made in the image of God. It doesn't matter what ethnicity you are. No human being can take the life of another human being. But as a naturalist, on what basis can Sam Harris say, Hitler, you're wrong?
Adam, did you have any thoughts on that?
I'm a little too polite for this format. I'll give you my general thought as to where we are. Okay, so the general idea of the debate is, okay, yes, we agree there's objective morality. There has to be, right? Anyone who says there's subjective morality, you just get lost, because anytime you try to make an argument for something being right or wrong, that's just what I feel, and there's no argument against it, and that's fair. So there has to be objective morality. Otherwise, there's no point to any argument whatsoever. And so then the question is, where do we get that? The irony that I noticed when I was watching the debate was both Harris and Craig are trying to argue for something objective, but they're both coming at it from a subjective standpoint, while neither of them recognizing that is what they are doing. Even Craig, we've had plenty of conversation now about Harris coming from a subjective standpoint, which is true, right? There's nothing out of at least Harris's arguments in this debate to say this idea of human flourishing is the absolute idea of human flourishing, and that's what it should always be, because that is subjective. That's based on his cultural upbringing, his preferences, his whatever. I really enjoyed the irony of his going to the audience and saying, we all agree with this, but that's just asking a bunch of subjective people, we think this way because we think this way. There's no objective thing there, right? Just all of us sharing our opinion, and it happens to be the same. But then equally, Craig is also coming from theology from an equally subjective standpoint. Craig's arguments for what he finds in the Bible to be true, or what he finds about God to be true, are equally based on his own cultural upbringing and his own ideas on the subject. And the full reality of this is that people are subjective. It's impossible not to be, right? We just are. I think like an American. I speak English. I love maple syrup because I grew up in New England. If I grown up somewhere else, I might not even know maple syrup existed. I have these preferences because of, we can get into where they come from, but I have preferences, and those views and those foundational ways of thinking are poured into everything that I look at. And I can unlearn them. I can learn to think in other ways. I can learn to add to the way that I think from perspectives from other people that think differently than I do. But at the end of the day, everyone is subjective, and trying to argue for objective morality from a subjective standpoint is just not possible. So to your
point, would you say that about math? I don't mean that,
but math is either.
No, but if something is objectively true, it's trivially true to say that we're subjective and that we're subjects, but we can still pursue truth objectively and pursue objective truth. We can still try to determine if something actually corresponds to reality or not. Math is true. 2 + 2 is true necessarily, just like I would say that torturing children is wrong necessarily, as in it couldn't possibly be false. If you do that, I just think, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just think it's important to bring up, because if you do that, you indict all of human knowledge.
Except that.
No, sorry.
No, Adam, I was interrupting on the interruption, so I apologize. But I appreciate what he said about math, and
it's the nature of the format. I mean,
exactly.
It is.
I appreciate it.
Feel free to cut me off too.
I will. So, Adam, you're finishing up.
Yeah, it's not to say, Rich, that there is no objective truth. That's not my point. But my point is that Harris and Craig are both arguing for something that is objective, but both are coming from a subjective standpoint. I for one, take issue with a lot of Craig's positions on theology, right? I have different opinions on what the Bible means myself. For example, he will appeal to God's commandments as the way that we know what the moral obligations are. But if I read the Bible and I look at the Old Testament, I see that the commandments, which we usually go to as Christians, the 10 commandments, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't whatever. It's not that I'm saying my point here is not that those are bad, but that those 10 commandments were part of the Mosaic covenant, which was for the Jewish people. It wasn't for the Gentiles. And so to try to make an argument that those rules apply to everyone all the time, and that those are the objective standards by which everyone will be judged, I think misses some of the context of what Scripture has to say. So I think that.
And you're saying that about the Ten Commandments? Just so
yes.
Listeners.
Yes.
I would fully disagree, though, that the Ten Commandments are those are apodictic laws, but
they're affirmed in the New Testament too.
I don't even know what apodictic means.
Apodictic meaning universally applicable. That's not part of Levitical or Mosaic.
Yeah, and if I could jump in, process this a little bit too, because Adam, you began by talking about we all agree in objectivity when it comes to morality, that there's an objective moral. I don't think that's true. I think that, in fact, I think some of the critiques I've read about Harris from people in his own camp are arguing against the idea that there is an objective moral. They take their worldview to its logical conclusion and they say there's our purpose of existence is evolution. There is no supreme being that created us. It's by chance. And so that foundation creates a worldview. If you take it out to its logical conclusion, there is no sense of objectivity. So I don't think it's a true premise that everybody approaches this with the sense that there's an objective moral.
No, and that was my point.
But the other thing would be then you're also saying that you're making the premise that there's this objectivity, there's an objective moral, but there's no one who has an objective approach to being able to determine what that objective moral is. You're saying both Harris and Craig are subjective in their process. My thought would be if there's an objective moral, there has to be some objectivity to being able to discern what that moral is. And that's where we come back to that epistemology issue. How do we know what we know? And so if what we know is purely by reason, then that there's some subjectivity to that. Though I do believe there's a conscience that speaks to the moral law that we all adhere to. In fact, I think he was at the beginning of his debate, Craig said to Harris that we agree. We agree a lot on, in fact, I would even say here with the five of us, we agree on there's a lot of moral congruence in what we believe to be moral, good, and wrong. We have that. The question is what becomes the foundation for that? And if there is an objective moral, there has to be some objective means to be able to determine that. And the two fundamental differences are that one is saying that revelation is a key to it determining what objective moral is. And the other doesn't believe in revelation because it doesn't believe in God. And so it becomes purely what's worked, what's demonstrated itself to be flourishing. And that can weigh into helping us to determine that. But obviously, it's not sufficient because our definitions of flourishing kind of vary. So,
do you think, Scott, though, that they vary within the Christian community or with God-believing community?
Sure.
God is my foundation community?
Yeah, definitely. And I think Rich brings up a good point that, Genesis 1-3, we are flawed people. And Christians are great for being hypocritical and saying one thing out of one side of the mouth and doing something out of the other side of the mouth. That's part of what Christianity is about. I know this is not the topic. Christianity isn't about one group being more moral than another group. It's one group recognizing our need for forgiveness because we are not what we. One of our main confessions is that forgive me for the fact that I do what I don't want to do and I don't do what I know I should do. So I can point to people who don't believe in God who are more moral than people who do believe in God. So that's not the issue. The issue becomes like, what is the foundation for being able to say there is a moral ought? If there's nothing that caused me to be, and I live here 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, and then I go into the dust. Jesus addressed that. He said, you might as well eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow you die. That's about it. And so I think that comes back to the question that Rich was asking. What is it that forms my moral obligation, to care about how I live or what I do? I mean, outside of the fact that it goes well for me, if I do, or it goes well for other people. But what is the thing that, for me, in my faith, it's I'm accountable to God. Like I know I have an accountability there. Now, do I do that as well as I should? No. But there's still something that's propelling me. And even the idea of flourishing is self-serving. I think the motive that happens here with a God orientation is it's not about self-flourishing, it's about self-sacrifice. Like, why am I motivated to be faithful to my wife? To make that sacrifice It's because I'm obligated before God, and I made a commitment before God, and there are times that I don't want to be, and there are times that I want to be. So it's that these are the things that hold me to that moral obligation. And I'm not saying that people who don't have that God orientation don't exhibit that same sacrifice. But what I am saying is I don't know where the moral ought comes from outside of that. So
it is curious how there isn't any difference between somebody who says there is absolutely no God and somebody who believes in a God. And they both have, some are super moral, some are medium, some are through insanity or through other means, moral decrepity or whatever, that they're behaving in a certain way and being unfaithful to their spouse or being faithful, where it does, where I think because there doesn't seem to be much of a difference, it makes me wonder where things are. And so Sam Harris had talked about things being innate and evolution, and that we learn and we are selfish. Flourishing is absolutely, partially it's selfish. It's for me. It's good when people aren't murdering, because then I'm not getting murdered or raped or this or that. It's good when people actually care, because I care about me. And then I care about others. And why do you care about others? It's just that empathetic feeling. And even animals will have that for other animals. A dog to other dogs aren't likely to end another same species life. It's not likely. It's more likely humans do that than any other animals, I think. But so that there's this innateness of caring, empathy, sympathy that we have. I was also thinking when Eric was talking, about Nazi and who can say that they were wrong, but so many of them were Christians. So they believed in a God, supposedly, but that God isn't telling them, or I don't even understand how that all works. I guess I get lost in, I think earlier on when we talked at the very beginning, we talked about how Sam Harris did the God is mean, or Christians are mean, or God people are mean, therefore, but it resonates for me that none of this is making sense because of what religious people, and I'm talking for Christians right now. So I'm going to talk about your Christian God and bring that up.
The fact that Sam Harris went in the direction of, yeah, but your God is mean. And the fact that, you seem to also be like, yeah, but your God, yeah, but Christians.
But I don't mean to interrupt, but while you're talking, I'm not saying that Christians are mean, or I'm just saying that it's not making sense to me. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful or rude, but it does not make sense to me. And
I think sometimes, like when I watch some of the Christopher Hitchens debates, I think sometimes atheists feel like the Christians are arguing that you can't be good without God.
Sometimes I hear that.
That if we take away God, everything is going to go to pieces, and people are just going to do horrible things. And people like a Christopher Hitchens or a Sam Harris are arguing, no, we recognize that's not good, and that we want human flourishing. We want to care for people and all of that. And Christians do plenty of terrible things. And so what's the difference?
That's more it. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Eric. I just want to hold that last moment, which is, that's it. What's the difference? That's it. There's no difference between me, who knows there's no God, and you, who knows that there is. There's no difference.
Yep. So that's a whole different conversation. I think it's just a fascinating conversation about the moral obligation. So what do we have to tell someone that they are wrong? And I think we're getting into this place. The more we remove God from society, I think the more it becomes about power. It becomes about whoever can get power, political power, whatever power, then we can enforce our morality. And that's the fear of, oh my goodness, if the Republicans get power, they're going to enforce their morality on us. And if the Democrats get power, they're going to enforce their morality on us. And it's this, because we don't have a shared moral obligation as a society. It's these are my feelings, these are my feelings. And I think again I'm fascinated by that transgender issue of what's going on in high school sports, where it's this, you have a couple assigned male at birth individuals who identify as young women who are dominating every race. And you have young women who are putting out lawsuits saying, hey, this is unfair. But who says what human flourishing is? The human flourishing of the two individuals who say, I'm better for identifying as a woman and running in sports, is that human flourishing worth more? And who says? What's the moral obligation on anyone in that? And I just feel like that's where a Sam Harris, that's where an atheist is going to struggle is to say, on what basis am I telling someone that racism is wrong? And what basis am I telling someone that what they believe is wrong? I can say, as a Christian, we both, again, Sam Harris agrees with me, with William Lane Craig, that racism is wrong. But on what basis does he believe it's wrong? For me, I say it's because every individual is made in the image of God. It doesn't matter what their race, sexual orientation, whatever, and they all need to be treated with respect and dignity. That's my foundation.
Yeah.
On what basis does someone say to a racist, you're wrong and you need to change your views, if you don't have a higher authority to point to? So in other words, Sam Harris can be an anti-racist. You could be someone who's not racist. But on what basis do you tell someone who is a racist that they're wrong?
Yeah, and I think that we do it by empathy and pain, that we share each other's pains, loss, their joys, that when what we are experiencing is what we want to propel forward, and that someone raping someone else is destructive to I think to mention Scott mentioning about the selfish, that we are all selfish, every single person, even Christians who they bring flowers home to their wife. It's, listen, we're just trying to show love to our spouse. There's just different things that we do for whatever reason, but our own selfishness, our own empathy, and our evolution. If we were all killing each other, we'd all be dead. And I think just looking to animals and how they respond, and us as being more formative animals and how we respond. That's all I'm going on, and that's all I got. I don't have any evidence of a God. So that's how I'm making sense. Rich, go ahead, please.
I figured the finger up would be easier than the...
Yeah, thank you.
I just want to point out, and feel free to respond, I think Adam might have touched on this as well, and he can give me his thoughts. The way I see it, the problem with evolutionary accounts of morality is, at best, all it's going to get you is moral epistemology. It's going to tell you how we come to know certain things. It's not going to ground anything for you. It's not going to tell you why we should do things. And on the empathy, actually, the last example you used, Gaia, was we recognize well-being. We shouldn't go around killing each other. Not for the people going around doing the killing. Predation has...
But if everybody felt that way, we'd all be dead. So that gets handled
except for the ones doing the killing, right?
Well, yeah, you isolate the problem. And so it's so far.
It's value against value. It's the value of life. And no, I value my money, territory, me and my tribe. We're going to kill everybody. And, we're going to dominate the earth. The question is, why is that wrong given naturalism? Because if we think of naturalism in evolutionary terms, predation has advantages as well. More food, more resources. So again, I haven't heard anything in the debate, and I haven't really heard anything as far as the source of moral obligation. Even mentioning something like, we recognize that rape is destructive or so on and so forth, that's still an epistemological claim. It's not an ontological claim. It doesn't explain why objective morality is embedded into the fabric of reality, if you will. And I sound like a natural law theorist right now.
No, I appreciate that perspective.
But so that's how I see evolutionary theories. Those are my thoughts. I don't know if even Eric or Scott, if you had any thoughts on those, you could agree or disagree. Maybe I'm missing something. Or Adam. Besides you, Gaia, who brought up evolutionary theories, and I couldn't remember if it was in the positive or negative light.
I thought that when you were talking about what's the difference, you can point to people who are Christian who are moral and not moral, and people who aren't Christian who are moral. Mm-hmm. The question that kind of jumped in my mind when you brought that up, or the statement, is that we would say, but it matters. It matters. And why does it matter?
What matters?
And why does it matter?
I think God.
And if we are a higher form of animal, to quote what you just said, why does it even matter? And it's almost like you're saying, I'm looking down the evolutionary scale to animals for my kind of basis of what I should do and what I shouldn't do.
I don't look to dogs to see what I should do, or I don't look down. I just know I'm looking up. I think that we've evoluted up.
Yeah. And I don't think any of us would disagree with you over the fact that you can point to people who are at varied degrees of living whatever moral outcome is. And I know, like when I lead a time of confession, someone asked me recently, why did you lead us in that confession on Sunday? Were you thinking of somebody who came and talked to you or something like that? I said, listen, I got enough of my own junk to confess. I got my own stuff to confess. I don't need to be worried about what you got to confess. But I think at the end of the day, what we're saying is, with a moral objective, it matters. Like this racism issue, it matters. But I think Eric raised a good question. Like, why does it matter? For a Christian, we would say we're all created in the image of God. And you are right to point out, to say that Christians aren't doing a really good job acknowledging that or addressing that. But that doesn't change the fact that there is an objective moral that should drive us to that. That's what drives me to that. And if even at the heart of an evolutionary kind of mindset of the survival of the fittest, that has a kind of a self-focused kind of view to it too. So I think these things, they do matter. And I think in our hearts, we all recognize that it does matter. I think that the pressing question is, why does it matter?
We should probably wrap up pretty soon. Adam and Eric, do you have any thoughts as well? What we just chatted about?
I have I'm sorry, Eric.
Go ahead. No, Adam, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, okay. This is more of a question than a statement, just more of a thought, as we've all been talking. And it was sparked by this idea. I was listening to a debate at work the other day between two people on this theistic, atheistic viewpoint, not necessarily related to morals, but just generally speaking. And they're both talking and they're debating for a while, and they're trying to figure out where each one stands and what's right and what's the more sound foundation for whatever the thing was. And I looked at my coworker and I said, this is all well and good, but at some point dinner has to be made and I have to go to the bathroom and my car needs to be fixed. And so this is all good. And it's good to think about this stuff. But like when you're in the midst of something and something is wrong or something is right, I feel like most people don't spend the time stopping to figure out, where am I getting this objective morality from? How do I know this is right or wrong? Like a lot of times in the moment, it's just this isn't cool and it bothers me, or I feel like I should be doing X, Y, or Z. And maybe that's something, right? Like most people, my kids, for example, if one of them gets their toy taken, they don't stop and go, that's not cool. And this is why I think so. That's just not cool. You just took my toy and I'm upset and that's not cool. And that's not to say that it's not good to think about these things. I think it's a good thing to think about these things. But anyway, so as I was thinking about this idea that for the most part, nobody really stops and thinks about, where am I getting this idea that this is right or wrong? So I started wondering, back to the kind of commandment issue. So Craig's point was that we know our moral duties based on God's commandments, right? Now, we might say that those are his written commandments, be they the 10 Commandments or the Levitical law or the Mosaic law or whatever you want to call it. We might even say that's prophetic revelation, right? The sort of instructions that come through the prophets in the Bible, or when he spoke to Adam and Eve in the garden. But how does anyone else know what those commandments are if they have not experienced the 10 Commandments or prophetic revelation or any of the sort of biblical narrative and history that we hold up? And I'm not even talking present, I'm talking historical as well, because you're looking at two whole continents of people who had no idea that Jesus was being crucified in Jerusalem until that story was brought over by the colonists like 500 years ago. So for millennia, you have people that didn't know any of this was going on, didn't have any access to written or prophetic revelation, at least that we know of in recorded history that we have in the Bible and other these, kind of historical accounts. And again, this is not really a statement, it's more of a question, and I'm not expecting an answer. I'm just thinking, how do we square? We know our moral obligations, our moral duties because of these revealed commandments, again, be it written or spoken or whatever. How do we square that's where they come from with people who have never, ever had access to any of that stuff? Yeah, so just a thought.
Okay. Eric, did you have some parting thoughts?
I have plenty of parting thoughts. I'm not ready to part. I could keep going another hour. Yeah, I think I would just reiterate something I said earlier, and it touches on when Adam was talking about the things you just need to do in your day. I think as you lose a shared foundation for morality as a culture, I think you turn more and more to power. That the only way we're not reasoning from the same objective standard, trying to figure out, well, is slavery right or wrong? Let's look at the text. So let's look at what God's word. Let's try to figure it out because we can agree on a foundation. Now, I think it's a lot about power. And I think if you have completely different views of what is moral flourishing or what is human flourishing, and you're not grounding it in the same place, some are saying it's based on evolution or it's based on revelation or whatever. I think you're finding in our culture more and more, it's becoming about who can get power, who can get political power, who can shame the other person, who can yell down the other person, who can get a mob that enforces something. And that's unfortunately where it is relevant to today, that it's not just about, we all agree that racism is wrong. It's, well, unfortunately, we don't all agree. There are people who don't, and we don't all agree in letting in immigrants or helping the poor or all of these sort of things. And without a shared foundation for moral understanding, it comes down to power plays a lot, and shaming and guilt and politics and all of that. That's why I think this kind of discussion is important. It's a discussion that's important to say, where do you ground moral obligation? On what basis are you telling someone this is right, this is wrong? And can you even do that?
I like leaving those questions, and I don't know if anybody else wants to have a parting thought. I know we heard a little bit from Rich and Scott near the end, but if you guys had anything else you want to say, and then we'll probably sign off at this point.
I'll just say really quickly in response to Adam, it's a very good question. I think that touches on a lot of other important issues. Maybe we could all rejoin and talk about the problems of Christian particularism and the unevangelized. But it's important to remember that this discussion between Craig and Harris is about moral ontology, the existence of morality. And how one comes to know that is a different question. And Scripture attests to the fact that there's revelation, but there's also intuition. There's an inner witness to, however we want to cash that out in philosophical terms. We read about that in Romans 2 and so on and so forth. And you'll also find that in other ancient laws, codes, moral treatises, that there's definitely deviation, but there's a lot of agreement. And so the question of moral epistemology is very interesting. It's very relevant, but it wasn't the topic of the discussion. And so if we go back to moral ontology, we need to find out what the source of our obligations are. And I think theism has the resources that naturalism, atheism does not. I'm done, Scott. Like you were getting ready to.
I think at the end of the day, I need to go to the bathroom.
Come on, Grandpa. Yeah, cut that out.
Gaia.
I think I will edit that out. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Gaia.
Yes, Scott.
Couple things. I've told you this on numerous occasions.
Yes.
I just really appreciate the way you engage conversation, and just really appreciate that.
Thank you.
I feel a little, I hope you don't feel like we were ganging up on you. So I appreciate you engaging with us. And these are good things for us to be thinking about, for us to both sharpen our understanding of things and then also understand where others are coming from to help us engage over these things. So thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you, Gaia. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. This is exciting. It sharpens my mind. It makes me think. I don't have the biggest brain, but I like to wrestle with what's going on and have conversations about what's truth and try to figure it out. And I only like to talk to people who are respectful back to me. I like people who are kind and nice and want to just grow and think. And that just helps. I think it's just building even relationships. I think Eric had brought up politics and things, and if we all hang out with each other, we're going to just work this out. We're going to get to that evolutionary place faster.
We'll get to that place. We'll get to that place of design. I agree. the teleology.
Well, listen, thanks everybody. I'm gonna hit the stop button. I'll put some links in for both of Eric and Scott, your churches, so that people can link to you guys, and then have descriptions and just in place underneath. Yeah, so we'll get some things wrapped up here. Thanks everybody for watching the debate and reading the transcript or just preparing it. And I know, sure, you can't solve everything in an hour. And even if we did this for days on end, we wouldn't solve these answers, but it's nice to ponder. We're going to sign off here, and I just want to thank my guests so much for joining me. I want to thank them for taking the time out to watch the debate with Sam Harris and William Lane Craig, and just to prepare for their notes and their discussions that they had with me. If you want to reach out with any questions or comments regarding this debate and any thoughts you have on morality, you can email me at facethesun2020@gmail.com. I'm intending to have another debate discussion or some other conversation. It doesn't have to revolve around a debate that we've watched and discussed, but something else that is either it's controversial or it's open for conversation that I would like to prepare for in January. And I haven't yet decided on that one. I might do one on a debate, is there a God? Or I might take a topic of conversation. So some of the hot topics that are discussed now in politics are in regards to abortion and in regards to gay rights. In March, I know what I want to have a discussion on. In March, I will have a debate discussion on the resurrection. I appreciate Bart Ehrman and a few others that take my side of views, and I'd like to have on a few Christians and a few atheists. So I'll be reaching out to university professors that are in the area and see if they can jump on for the January discussion or for the March discussion. So thanks for listening to this week's episode. And before I sign off, I just want to remind you to face the sun.